Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm joined today by Ann Vucic, and we're going to be discussing Medjugorje, or to be more specific, we're going to be discussing a specific objection to Medjugorje and maybe some more details about that and give people maybe something to think about, particularly if that's an objection that they often use to say that they don't believe in Medjugorje or they think it discredits Medjugorje. Before we do that, let me just introduce Ann Vucic. And by the way, this is the second time we're doing this. I'm going to be candid. We have done this whole thing before, and we had some technical issues, let's say, and Ann has been kind enough to come back and do the whole thing again. So I'm very grateful to her for that. Ann Vucic is a Croatian-American born just a few miles away from Medjugorje. She's lived in the USA since she was 2 years old. In 1981, Ann experienced a radical conversion while visiting her homeland during the first week of the Virgin Mary's apparitions in Medjugorje. Ann has since worked extensively as an interpreter for the Medjugorje visionaries and priests. She's hosted a radio show on Radio Maria USA called Medjugorje, A Message of Hope for the World, and frequently speaks about Medjugorje on radio shows and social media programming. She's written numerous articles on Medjugorje, as well as several books on their way to being published, so look out for those. Ann is also a consultant and executive producer for a major Hollywood movie about Medjugorje, currently in development. Ann, it says you had a radical conversion. Were you an atheist before, or were you kind of like a non-practicing Catholic when this happened and converted you?
Well, first of all, Wojciech, thank you. It's great to be with you. Greetings to everybody to your audience. It's great to be with all of you. Yes, Wojciech and I joked about this. We've had quite the roadblocks to getting to this interview, but hopefully all will go smoothly this time. So yeah, yes, in terms of my own conversion, was born and raised in a Catholic family, a very loving, faithful Catholic family. Many members of my family were religious sisters. My mom's brother was a priest. He was the pastor of our parish for almost all of my growing up years. But because of some issues that happened in my own life, just some sort of pain that happened, mostly as a result of being bullied in school, I became very angry, and I basically kind of came to the point, by the time I was, 13, 14 years old and full of wisdom, I decided that there was no God. And if there was a God, I really kind of didn't want anything to do with him, because I couldn't understand why a loving God would allow a kid like me to go through the kind of, pain that I had gone through the bullying that I went through. So I turned away from God. I had to go to church because my family was Catholic, but I really wanted nothing to do with it. And so when my own conversion happened, it was like a lightning bolt. It just was instantaneous, sudden. The minute that I heard the words, "Our Lady has appeared in Medjugorje," my life instantly changed. I had an encounter with God that forever changed my heart and changed the entire trajectory of my life. It's why I'm sitting here today doing this interview with you, and a lot of the other things that I'm doing that the Lord has led me to over the years.
Yeah, I know a lot of people have had similar stories with Medjugorje, haven't they, where it's just radically changed them, as you say. But today we're going to talk about this specific issue. Before we get to the objection itself, let's kind of give people a bit of a background on the area, and anything that you think is relevant, maybe politically or just even the setup religiously, what's going on in that area, so people can maybe understand a little bit later on some of the things that happen.
Yeah, and I'm so glad to have the opportunity to talk about this, because this is a really important issue. This objection that we're talking about is one of the biggest objections that people have to Medjugorje, and that is that the Franciscans, they often say the Franciscans are disobedient to the local bishop. And in order to understand fully really what that relates to and what that is about, it really is important to go a couple of hundred years back in history to understand what is happening there. So first of all, in the mid 1300s, the first Franciscan missionaries came to that region, the region that we now call the region of the former Yugoslavia, that of course broke up into several countries. So the region that we now call, the country that we now call Bosnia-Herzegovina. So in the mid-1300s, the Franciscans came there. Their efforts to convert the locals was just extremely successful. The people reacted really, really well to the missionary efforts of the Franciscans. And within a matter of several years, they had established, I think, somewhere around 30 or 40 monasteries that dotted the entire region. And so the faith was really flourishing. The Catholic faith was really flourishing. That whole region, most of the people were either Catholic or Orthodox. And then what happened? Just within 60, 70 years, the advancement of the Ottoman armies came in through the region, and people were given three choices. You either accept Islam, you flee the region, or you die. Those were your only choices. And so most of the people that remained, they were forced to convert to to Islam. The Franciscans at the time chose to remain with the people. They did not flee. They went underground. They had to secretly remain so that the faith could remain alive. But they did. They did continue their missionary efforts with the people. And it's important to say that they were the only representatives of the church that were there. There was no diocesan priesthood in the region. There really weren't other religious orders there. It was entirely the Franciscans that were there, keeping the faith alive among the people. And so what ended up happening, once in the late 1800s, the Austro-Hungarian Empire then came into the region, took power, took control, and the Ottomans, the Muslims, were forced to leave. And with the arrival of the Ottoman Empire into the region, the Austro-Hungarian Empire into the region, and of course they were Catholic, the church then was finally able to establish an official, the normal hierarchical structure of the church in the region. Up to then, there hadn't been dioceses, there hadn't been diocesan bishops, there hadn't been diocesan priests. It was just the Franciscans who were ministering there among the people. And so, to put it in context, this is a region, especially around where Medjugorje is at. These are farming people. My family that is from that region, my parents were farmers growing up, and to be a farmer, you didn't need much of an education. So you were sent to school only to get kind of the basics. My father had a third grade education. My mother had a fourth grade education. And that was pretty typical of the people in the region. So there wasn't, education wasn't something that was considered important because your life was going to be the life of a tobacco farmer, of a grape farmer, right? So, and the only church that the locals knew, the only representatives of the church the locals knew were Franciscans. And if you asked any of the people in that region, they thought that every single priest, including every bishop and every pope in the world, every pope in the history of the church, they thought every representative of the church was Franciscan. They didn't know of any other kind of priesthood. So when the church, when the Vatican established a hierarchical structure, when they brought in the diocesan, they established the diocese, and they brought in priests who then later became the bishops of the region and established a diocesan priesthood, the people were really confused. They didn't understand. The people were used to their priests walking around in brown robes, and all of a sudden these men were there who were there in the black suits and the white collars, and they didn't understand. And a lot of the people actually thought that these new priests coming in were not Catholic. They didn't understand that there's lots of different ways of being priests in the church. And so the priests, there was a great resistance among the people to accept the diocesan priests because, because they really didn't know initially that they were Catholic priests. But even after they sort of understood that this wasn't some kind of another cult coming in, the people loved their Franciscans. The Franciscans had served in the region for 500 years, kept the faith of the people alive, and the people loved their Franciscan priests. And so when the diocesan priesthood was established, there was a great tension among the people, not so much among the hierarchy and the Franciscan hierarchy, but among the people. There was great resistance. The people did not want to accept the diocesan priesthood. It got to the point that it actually required Vatican intervention to come to sort of a a resolution to the issue. And in 1975, Pope, I think it was Paul VI, put out a papal decree. It was called Romanus Pontificibus, which basically divided the parishes of the region. It basically said, okay, these parishes will belong to the Franciscans, and these parishes will belong to the diocesan priesthood. And once that decree was distributed, it was then very clear where the Franciscans would minister and where the diocesan priesthood would minister. It took a number of years for that decree to be implemented. But once it sort of finally was, one of the issues, and this leads us to the sort of the modern day conflict that people call the Herzegovinian affair. One of the problems was that in some of the parishes that were supposed to be handed over by the Franciscans to the diocese, the people didn't want to accept the priest, and those Franciscan priests did not want to leave. So that's the crux of the situation, which is called the Herzegovinian affair. What happened was there were 11 Franciscan priests who basically said, we are not going to leave these parishes. These are our people. We are here to minister to them, and we are not going to leave. So basically, these 11 Franciscan priests were in disobedience to that papal decree, the Romanus Pontificibus. They were refusing to leave. And what happened was the Franciscan order itself, the Franciscan order of Herzegovina, expelled those 11 priests from the order. So at that point, once the Franciscans expelled those disobedient 11 priests from the order, the issue at that point was between those 11 Franciscan priests and the bishop, because the Franciscan order of Herzegovina did the right thing. They when those Franciscans refused to leave those parishes, when they refused to be obedient to their Franciscan superiors, to the orders of the Vatican, the Franciscan order was left with no choice but to expel them. The problem is that a lot of people conflate the situation. They say that those 11 Franciscan priests, those disobedient 11 Franciscan priests, are still a part of the Franciscan order. They basically, a lot of people basically don't understand that the Franciscans actually expelled them in obedience to what the church was asking. So that's kind of the crux of the matter.
Yeah, because you often hear in arguments people make against Medjugorje, or the Franciscans are being disobedient generally, don't you? And as you said, they don't make the distinction between those who have actually been expelled by the Franciscans and the actual Franciscans. Now, I believe some of those Franciscans, if not all of them, that have been expelled still have their own places, their own churches where they kind of have mass?
No, well, the issue is still not resolved. There's actually several of those 11 have died in the meantime. This was all over the course of the last, 40 years, 30, 40, 50 years. Excuse me. So several of those Franciscans have died. I don't remember how many now still remain. There might be 3 or 4 or 5 that still remain in those parishes. So there are still several parishes right in the vicinity of Medjugorje that still are served, quote unquote, by these priests, and that have been not only expelled by the Franciscan order, but have been laicized by the church. So there are entire communities in the region, because part of the problem is the people refuse to accept the diocesan priests. There was a period of time when those priests did leave those parishes, and diocesan priests actually tried to come in to take over the administration of the parishes. And quite literally, the people of the region came with like rifles and, weapons, and basically said, you are not taking over our churches. You're not taking over our church. So they basically repelled those diocesan priests, and then those Franciscans returned. So part of it is the people don't want to let go of those particular Franciscan priests, and those Franciscan priests, I call them Franciscan priests, they really no longer are Franciscan priests. Those men have refused to leave. It's important to note, it's very important to note, that in the papal decree, the Romanus Pontificibus, Medjugorje, which is administered by Franciscans, was never one of the parishes that was supposed to be handed over to the diocese. The parish of Medjugorje, according to the papal decree, always was in the hands of the Franciscans, and it was decreed to remain in the hands of the Franciscans. So those disobedient Franciscans never had anything to do with Medjugorje. They were not in Medjugorje, but because the Franciscan order still runs the parish of Medjugorje, people just kind of threw in the baby with the bathwater, right? They kind of put it all together and said, well, the Franciscans are disobedient, so Our Lady would never come to a place where there's disobedience in the church. Well, the reality is the Franciscans that serve in Medjugorje and the hierarchy of that Franciscan order always was obedient to the decrees of the Vatican as far as all of that is concerned.
Yeah. Yes, that's very important to know. So thank you for that, Anne. Let's get to the actual apparitions and then the bishop and his response to them. So the apparitions began June 24th, 1981, and probably not long after that, the Bishop of Mostar, Bishop Zanic, had to react, had to respond, had to come over. So do you want to give us a kind of overview of what was going on around that time, just as the apparitions were starting, and what was happening after that?
Yeah, so it's important to, it's important to look at context, to put things in a historical context and also in a spiritual context. So I just laid out one aspect of the spiritual context that was happening in the time, the issue with the Franciscans and the church. That's one aspect of the spiritual context. I'll get to a second issue in a second too, but I just want to also lay the foundation for the political context that was happening at the time as well, because that's also very important. So if you recall, for those of us who were alive back then, the late 70s and the early 80s, cracks began to appear in the Soviet machine, in the communist sort of, especially in Eastern Europe. People will recall that 1978, John Paul was elected, St. John Paul the Great was elected as Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, right? And the first thing that he did after being elected was to go to Poland. As a result of his visit to Poland, the Solidarity movement was born, where the people basically tried to united against the communist regime. So there was a crack appearing there. Pope John Paul was very vocal in his support of the Solidarity movement. The other thing that happened was in the communist country of Yugoslavia, where Medjugorje was located, the president, or the leader of that country, who had been the leader from the end of World War II, up until that point, the only leader that Yugoslavia ever had, it was the same leader, Joseph Tito. He died in 1980, and he was really the only force that held the communist country of Yugoslavia together. After he died, kind of the cracks started to sort of appear. Ethnic tensions began to arise in the country, and sort of ethnic, that country, the country of Yugoslavia, it was basically created after World War II by putting several different ethnicities, nationalities forced together under a communist regime. Well, these people never wanted to be together and in a country. And after Tito died, some of these national sort of identities began to arise. And in that context of things beginning to sort of cracks beginning to show in the communist sort of world, in the midst of all of that, Our Lady appears in Medjugorje. And it's really interesting to note and important to note that very quickly, the apparitions began June 24th, 1981. My family happened to be there on vacation that summer. We were living in Chicago, but we went there that summer, got there 2 weeks before the apparitions began. And we went there that summer to go on a summer vacation to visit our family. And so the apparitions began June 24th, 1981. 4 days later is when I heard about it, when my own conversion happened. That was a Saturday. That was a Saturday afternoon, Saturday morning. Saturday afternoon, 4 days after the apparitions began, my parents went to Medjugorje to see what was happening there, because we had heard about these events. 4 days after the apparitions began, there were about, by communist estimates, there were between 7,000 and 10,000 people there. So this word of this event spread like wildfire. It was all over. And by the way, this is a region where people didn't really have telephones. Very few people had cars. There wasn't an easy way to spread information around. And yet, 4 days after these events began, massive, massive crowds were present in Medjugorje. And those crowds only multiplied. They continued to grow. They expanded. And so, of course, because, you know, this was a communist country, and of course we know that the communist ideology and Catholicism, Christianity, those are two incompatible things. Yugoslavia was a little bit different from other communist countries in the sense that in Yugoslavia, although it was a hardline communist country, they did allow the practice of the faith. But what they did not allow, like you could practice your faith within a church. You could go to church, you could go to mass. Of course, if you did that, you couldn't be a practicing Catholic and have any positions of power and authority in the government. Like you either became, if you wanted to practice your faith, your choice was basically to live a simple farmer life. Like you couldn't have any influence in the society, but you could choose to be a practicing Catholic. What was not allowed was public expressions of faith. And so the fact that there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people gathering on this hill in this little village in the middle of nowhere was very alarming to the communists of the region. And so within a matter of days, the communists were already there, were already aware of what was happening, already made their presence known. And it was a threat, you know, and again, this is where it's important to understand the context. You know, there were cracks in the wall in these other communist countries. And all of a sudden now in Yugoslavia, there's also cracks in the wall because these 6 children are suddenly claiming these supernatural events and the people are reacting and they're showing up and there's a fervent expression of faith. Well, that was deeply concerning to the communists. So that was the political context of the time. One of the things that's interesting to note, and we'll get to the bishop in a second, one of the things that's interesting to note is when communism fell and communist archives came out into the open, there is documentation that I think within a matter of a week or 10 days, I don't remember the exact time frame, that agents from the Kremlin, KGB agents from the Kremlin were already 8 or 10 days after the apparitions began, were already dispatched to the area to talk to the local government, communist government officials to say, what the heck is going on in your country that there are thousands of faithful, which they consider to be a political uprising. Why is there a political uprising happening in your country? You have to put a stop to it. So that's kind of a little bit of that whole context of what was happening in the times when Our Lady appeared.
Right. And then, of course, in that time, Bishop Zanic has to, because the bishop normally, when something like this is going on, he has to come over and he has to kind of investigate, doesn't he, and look into it. So he comes over, I suppose, and I know that at the beginning, he had a very positive response. I think in one of his first sermons, he said that, you know, these children are telling the truth, that they don't lie. And then gradually it seemed he would change his mind. So is it possible to explain why that might have happened?
Yes. So, yeah, as you said, he was he came to Medjugorje. He was very public in his support of the visionaries. He had done an interview that was in the local Catholic diocesan newspaper where he said, these children are not lying. What happened to change his mind? There's one explanation, one reason that he gave in terms of why he changed his mind. And then there's a second potential reason that people speculate on. I'll cover both of those. So the reason that he gave for why he changed his mind about the apparitions. So there was a situation where there were 2 priests, Franciscan priests in the region, who were part of the Franciscan order there, that he expelled from the priesthood. Now, there was a lot of controversy about the case, about why he expelled them, whether the priests were guilty of, you know, whatever he said they were guilty of. Frankly, I don't know the details of what the issue was that he had with them, but basically he basically believed that they were guilty of something or other, and he expelled them from the Franciscan order. The two Franciscan priests claimed complete innocence, that they were not guilty of what he said they were guilty of. And it became quite an issue in the church there and among the locals, because the locals loved the people. Loved these priests. And so, and by the way, these priests, again, important to note, these priests did not serve in Medjugorje. They never had any connection to Medjugorje. They were not in Medjugorje. So they are a complete separate issue that was going on in the church at the time. But what happened was, this was in the very beginning, like in the summer of 1981, shortly after the apparitions began. People said to the visionaries, people were so upset about this and felt that this was an injustice. And so they went to the visionaries and they said, could you please ask the Blessed Mother if she has a comment to make about this, about the situation about the two priests, about the actions of the bishop. So the visionaries did. They asked Our Lady, and allegedly Our Lady said, she didn't say that the bishop was right or wrong in his decision. What she said was that the bishop acted too rashly in making the decision, that he needed to investigate more, basically, something along those lines. When the bishop heard this, he basically said, well, there's no way that that's actually the Blessed Mother. He interpreted the words of the Blessed Mother to mean that she was speaking contrary to a bishop of the church. And he basically said, if this was really the true Blessed Mother, she would not speak in any way contrary to a bishop of the church. Therefore, these apparitions cannot be authentic. And it was from that point on that his perspective on the apparitions changed. But it's very interesting to note what happened afterwards. Those two priests took their case all the way to the Vatican. They felt this was a grave injustice, and they took their case to the Vatican. You know, and as we know with the church, sometimes things take a long time. This was, 1981. It took 12 years. So by 1993, the Vatican actually finally issued a statement about the case. In 1993, the Vatican basically said exactly what the Blessed Mother said. The Vatican reversed the bishop's ruling, reinstated their priesthood, and basically said the bishop acted too quickly, that he did not have enough information to make the decision that he made. Unfortunately, in the meantime, one of those priests ended up leaving the priesthood. He just, I guess, I don't know, he must not have wanted to wait for the whole process to go through. He ended up leaving the priesthood and got married. But the second priest, he waited for the decision of the church. He was reinstated back into his priesthood. He did choose to leave that diocese because he didn't want to minister in that diocese anymore, but he continued to serve as a priest in another diocese of the church in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Mm-hmm. And so that was that whole situation that led to the bishop saying Medjugorje is not authentic. The second sort of theory, that's what the bishop said in terms of why he changed his mind. But a second theory about what could have also led to him being, because he didn't just change his mind, he became vocally, irately anti these apparitions. And so some of the thinking is that when the communists couldn't stop the visionaries themselves, the communists tried to stop the visionaries in many, many ways. They tried to get them to admit that they were lying. They tried to get them to recant their stories, to say that this was a falsehood, that they made this whole thing up. And the visionaries refused under tremendous pressure from the communists, but they refused. They said, we can't lie. This is what happened. We see Our Lady. And so there's some speculation, again, this is speculation, that there was pressure from the communists, possibly even some kind of, blackmail, who knows, trying to force the bishop to really put to crack down on these apparitions and to put a stop to it. Is that true or not? I don't know. There's lots of rumors that it actually is true, but he certainly made it clear that his reasoning for being against the apparitions was this whole case with the two priests.
Yeah. So the first one I just say is straight from his mouth, really. He said, this is why.
Correct.
he doesn't think it happened because he couldn't see Virgin Mary contradicting him. And then the second one is people saying this could well have been the involvement of the communists could have had something to do with it as well, pressuring him basically.
Yes.
I know that if you want to tell us a little bit about the next bishop, Bishop Perić, wasn't it? He kind of parroted. Did he sort of repeat what the previous bishop said? Did he say anything different?
Yeah. So when he became bishop, Bishop Ratko Perić became bishop during the time of the war in the former Yugoslavia, and it was a time of crisis in the church. You know, there was when the war broke out in the former Yugoslavia, the first line of attack by the communists was to attack churches, monasteries, convents, any and all religious institutions. There were several attempts made on the life of Bishop Zanic, the first bishop, and on the cathedral of the town of Mostar. And because it was wartime, Bishop Zanic submitted his request to the Vatican, basically said, you know, I could be killed at any moment. We need to have in place my successor needs to be in place in case I'm killed at any moment. And his recommendation for a successor was Bishop Ratko Perić. Would the Vatican have chosen him, you know, were it not wartime? I don't know, maybe they would have, but it is clear that that there wasn't the normal procedure for choosing a successor to the bishop. You know, there wasn't, it was basically done as an emergency thing. He was named as the successor in case something happened to Bishop Zanic, and then eventually he did become the bishop. And he continued Bishop Zanic's anti-Medjugorje stance, and not only continued it, but he took it to sort of even greater lengths. He was very much, he was very vocal about his opposition to Medjugorje. He denounced it at any chance that he got. But it's interesting to note, Bishop Perić, is on record as saying that he doesn't even believe in Lourdes and Fatima, that he doesn't believe in supernatural things happening. So, you know, most of it probably was, you know, related to things happening in Medjugorje specifically, but part of it was, it appears that, you know, he had an issue with sort of this kind of phenomenon happening in the church, period. And he, you know, he made it very difficult for Medjugorje. But you know what? The beautiful thing is that, you know, many people, when people say that the Franciscans were disobedient to the church and the visionaries were disobedient to the bishop, it's actually, you know, part of what they're referring to was the issue that we talked about before, the Franciscans and that whole issue. But part of what they're also referring to is this belief that the bishop was ordering them to do things and they were refusing, which is actually not true. When the bishop ordered that they stop having the apparitions in the church, they stopped having apparitions in the church. They moved it to the rectory. When the bishop didn't want it in the rectory on any church property, they moved it elsewhere. When the bishop wanted them to stop speaking publicly about Medjugorje, they stopped speaking publicly about Medjugorje. So every directive that was, the only thing that they could not be obedient to was they couldn't stop the apparitions, you know, because they can't control Our Lady. They can't control heaven. So they couldn't stop the apparitions. They couldn't stop having these phenomenon. But every other directive that the bishop gave, they were obedient to. But it wasn't enough for him. He still adamantly refused to accept the authenticity of Medjugorje.
Mm-hmm. And after that bishop, are we on to the current bishop now, or is there another one before that?
No, it's the current bishop now. And so one of the things that happened was the original bishop established a commission in 1982, I think it was, to investigate Medjugorje. We're kind of jumping back and forth between the bishops, but just to kind of get us to where we are today, established a commission to investigate Medjugorje. That commission found, the findings of that commission were that Medjugorje was not authentic. Normally, under normal circumstances, those findings of a bishop, you know, when some mystical phenomenon happens in a diocese and the bishop investigates, those findings are accepted and, you know, you move on. Well, the interesting thing that happened is that at the time when Bishop Zanic, the first bishop, submitted his findings that Medjugorje was not authentic, he submitted those findings to the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, which Cardinal Ratzinger was the head of at the time, Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict. Under Ratzinger's Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, those findings were rejected. He basically said that the congregation basically said, we do not accept your findings that Medjugorje is not authentic. And not only that, this is really, excuse me, this is one of the most critical things to know about Medjugorje that people oftentimes do not know. When Cardinal Ratzinger's commission said that we do not accept the findings of Bishop Zanic's commission, he did two very important things. First, he rejected those findings. Secondly, he stripped the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, stripped the local bishop and all of his successors from having any jurisdiction about the apparitions of Medjugorje. The bishop still had jurisdiction over the parish, over the running of the parish, over which priest would be assigned or not assigned to the parish. Was it still responsible for the spiritual life of the parish? All of that remained. But the local bishop was stripped of his authority to make any definitive findings about Medjugorje. And that remains in effect. And so when Bishop Peric made statements against Medjugorje in the church, many people, and this is the crux of the matter, so many people basically said, well, the bishop has spoken against it, we have to be obedient to that. When in actuality, that's not the case. When the Bishop Peric, when he spoke against Medjugorje, he was speaking against Medjugorje in his own, it was a matter of his own opinion, which was very much clarified later on by Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, who was I think he was, Secretary of State at the time, or I don't remember what his position was at the time, but he had a very high level position at the Vatican. And a question came to him because there was great confusion in the church. People were saying, Bishop Peric is speaking against Medjugorje, and yet people are not being obedient to him. So how do we interpret his position about Medjugorje? Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, and people can look this up online. They can, they don't have to take my word for it. They can look all of this information up online and find it themselves. Cardinal Bertone, this was presented to Cardinal Bertone in a letter from a bishop who was asking for clarification. Cardinal Bertone, can you please clarify for us what is the position of Bishop Peric related to Medjugorje? Cardinal Bertone, in the response to this request from the bishop, basically said, Bishop Peric, he is expressing his opinion, but it is his personal opinion, and it is his personal opinion and is not binding on the faithful, because that authority about the apparitions of Medjugorje was taken away from him. So when the Bishop of Mostar said to people, do not come to Medjugorje, he's just saying that in his own opinion, and that position does not have a binding effect on the faithful.
So the Vatican rejects Bishop Zanic's commission, because Bishop Zanic puts together a whole commission with various priests, and he comes to the conclusion that nothing supernatural is happening there. The Vatican rejects that, and then what happens after that?
Yeah, so this is also so important for people to understand. So basically what happened after that, after jurisdiction over the phenomenon of the apparitions was stripped from Bishop Zanic, the Vatican basically took that jurisdiction, took that authority, and placed it in the hands of all of the bishops of former Yugoslavia. So the Vatican creates this new commission, so to speak, which consists of all the bishops of former Yugoslavia, and said, now the jurisdiction is in your hands. They, in 1991, they had a meeting, the bishops of former Yugoslavia had a meeting in a town called Zadar, Z-A-D-A-R, and at their bishops' conference meeting in Zadar, they issued a statement about Medjugorje. They discussed at length the matter of Medjugorje, and they put out the official position of the church. And by the way, this remains the official position of the church up until this day, to be honest, to be clear. And it's called, so that document is called the Zadar Declaration. People can look that up and see for themselves. You don't have to take my word for it. So what happened in Zadar at that bishop's meeting? They, in church kind of language or church procedure, There's three options that the bishops could have chosen in terms of what their pronouncement about Medjugorje is going to be. They could choose option one is to say there is no supernatural phenomenon happening in Medjugorje. Option two is there is a supernatural phenomenon happening in Medjugorje. And option three is we are not yet certain whether there is a supernatural phenomenon happening in Medjugorje. And the bishops at the Zadar meeting, the bishops wrote in the Zadar declaration that they chose that third option, that we are not, they didn't say it is authentic, they didn't say it is not authentic. They said we are not yet certain of supernatural origin. Basically, they're saying wait and see. In addition to that, they also said, in the meantime, pilgrims are able to go to Medjugorje, and priests are able to accompany pilgrims for their spiritual needs. That was the position, that is the position of the church as far as Medjugorje is concerned, that it is not yet certain of its supernatural origin, meaning we're going to investigate more and see, that pilgrims can go in the meantime, and that priests can also go. The one restriction was that no official Catholic entity was allowed to organize a pilgrimage. So, for example, I, as a laywoman in the church, I am able to and have organized pilgrimages to Medjugorje. Many, many priests have come with me, but my local parish, my local diocese could not officially organize pilgrimages. I could organize a pilgrimage, for whoever, and that was, the church said that was fine. That was the position, that is up. Most of that is still the position of the church today. But what happened in the meantime? That was in 1991. In 2010, Pope Benedict established a new commission to investigate Medjugorje. And that new commission was headed by a cardinal named Cardinal Camillo Ruini. So that commission is called the Ruini Commission, named after the head of the commission. And interesting to note, there's a lot of misunderstandings about that commission. I've spoken to several people who were who were witnesses at the meetings for that Ruini Commission. Basically, what the Ruini Commission did was they separated the phenomenon of the apparitions into two parts. Everything that happened in the first 7 days, and then everything that happened after those first 7 days. So the focus of the Ruini Commission was primarily what happened in those first 7 days. And the Ruini Commission met, I think, a total of 17 or 18 times, I don't remember, but between 2010 and 2014. And in 2014, the Ruini Commission completed its investigation of Medjugorje and submitted its findings to the Vatican. Interesting to note that the Ruini Commission, the Vatican has not yet publicly released the findings of the Ruini Commission, but in 2017, the findings of the Ruini Commission were leaked by a journalist. And now some people have said, in response to the fact that these findings were leaked by this journalist, some people have said, well, we don't know that those are the authentic findings or recommendations of the Ruini Commission. But when you do a little bit more research, what you will find is that the journalist who leaked those findings was later named, I forget what his position was. He was named as, like, I don't know, was it director of communications or something in the Vatican? Like, he was given a position of prominence in the Vatican. If he had done something improper by leaking these findings, I doubt that the Vatican would give him a position of power and influence within the Vatican itself. So when he leaked these findings, we learned then what the commission recommended. And what the commission recommended is that several things. One, that the first 7 days of the apparitions be approved. And this is, let me just say a word about this. A lot of people, when they heard that, what they interpreted that to mean is that the church recognizes the authenticity of the first 7 days, but that everything after that, they don't believe is authentic. But you have to put that in the context of understanding what the Ruini Commission did. The Ruini Commission only investigated primarily the first 7 days. So their recommendation to approve those first 7 days was based on the fact that that's all they primarily investigated. They didn't investigate primarily anything beyond that. And so they weren't able to comment on the authenticity of the apparitions after those first 7 days. So they recommended that the first 7 days be approved. And by the way, that doesn't mean that those first 7 days are approved. That was their recommendation that was submitted to the Vatican. The Vatican has not yet taken action on that recommendation. The other thing that they recommended is that pilgrimages be approved. That did happen. Official pilgrimages were approved in, I think it was 2018, which basically meant that now any official Catholic entity, any Catholic parish, any Catholic diocese, any and every Catholic organization that wanted to organize an official pilgrimage to Medjugorje was now finally able to do so. Huge step in the right direction. So they and the other thing that happened as a result of the Ruini Commission is that now this I find so exciting. This is just so wonderful. They created a position. They created they sent what they call an apostolic visitor to Medjugorje, and that basically means not so much the parish continues to remain under sort of the jurisdiction of the local diocese, but everything related to the apparitions, to the phenomenon of the pilgrims, to Medjugorje as kind of like a shrine, a pilgrimage shrine, that was placed under the authority of this apostolic visitor. So that basically means that the shrine of Medjugorje, the experience of the pilgrims, all of that is basically now directly under Vatican control. The original apostolic visitor sent to Medjugorje, his name was Bishop Aldo Cavalli. He was sent there in 2018. Unfortunately, he died actually of COVID in, I think it was 2021. And the Vatican then sent a new apostolic visitor, Bishop Aldo Cavalli, who is currently in Medjugorje. And it's interesting to note, most shrines in the church, in fact, all shrines in the church, they're within a local diocese, right? And so there's usually a shrine director, but then they're within the local diocese under the jurisdiction of the local bishop. Medjugorje, as far as I know, is the only shrine in the church today that has its own bishop who is in residence in Medjugorje, who reports directly to the Vatican. So basically putting Medjugorje effectively under Vatican control. That's the current status of Medjugorje today. So for those people who say that Medjugorje is not approved by the church, well, yes, it's officially not yet approved by the church, but there's also many who believe that it's probably not going to receive official approval status until the apparitions come to an end. If you know anything about Medjugorje, you know the apparitions are ongoing. 3 of the visionaries still receive daily apparitions. But in the meantime, the Vatican has done everything that it possibly could to show its support by approving official pilgrimages, by sending an apostolic visitor there. In the meantime, many cardinals from around the world have now started flocking to Medjugorje, coming to Medjugorje for various events, including the new Bishop of Mostar, who, though he does not have jurisdiction over the apparitions, he is working now very closely with the Franciscans. He's been to Medjugorje on many occasions. He's been there for big events like the youth festival and other things. So everything in Medjugorje has turned around, and it's been, for those of us who love Medjugorje and follow it, it's been really exciting to see what the hand of the Spirit has done over the last several years.
One thing that's important again for people to know is, for those people who certainly go for the disobedience line and say, look, they've been disobedient to the bishop. As you've mentioned during this discussion, on 2 occasions, the Vatican has overridden what the bishop, or certainly what Bishop Zanic did, right? So the first one was with the Franciscans that he expelled, and after the Vatican took that over, they thought actually he shouldn't have done that. And then they rejected his findings as well in relation to Medjugorje and said actually they're gonna look into this themselves. So if you want to be obedient to the church, then you're fine to sort of, well, I suppose what your opinion should be right now is, we don't know yet. Let the church investigate, and then if you want to say I think it might be happening, or if I think it might not be, but I'm still going to wait, that would be a fair thing to say. But if you're going to appeal to this idea of disobedience, that's kind of gone now, because the Vatican has actually rejected what the bishop originally said, right?
Correct. Yeah. And, I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think there's another thing that's really important to say. So as you said, a couple of times now, the Vatican has overturned what Bishop Zanic has done. And they've thrown as full of support as they can behind Medjugorje without actually approving it to this point yet. But here's an interesting thing. Many people incorrectly believe that you actually can't go. I've had so many people say this to me. We should not be going to Medjugorje until the church approves it. That's one of the things that so many people say. That's actually not church teaching. It's actually incorrect church teaching, because when you look at what criteria does the church look at to determine whether a place of apparition is authentic, they look at two things. One, they look at what are the messages coming out of there. Is there anything contrary to the faith? If that's sort of clear, if that's all good, the next one that they look at is what are the fruits that are coming out of there? Well, how do fruits manifest in people's life? How do fruits manifest in a place of apparition? By people going there and having an encounter with God, returning to the sacraments, living a deeper spiritual life, beginning to pray more, receiving, going to confession, incorporating more of the treasures of the church into their life. In order for the church to approve a place of apparition, the church needs to see that people are going. The church needs to see that people are flocking there. So those people that say we can't go to a place of apparition until it is approved, that's not what the church teaches. If 80,000 people refused to go to Fatima until Fatima was approved, those 80,000 people would not have been there to witness the miracle of the sun, which is part of what led to the approval of Fatima in the first place. So the fact that people are flocking there is a sign that it is authentic. And that's one of the signs that the church looks at. So I would say to anybody listening to this, if you feel like, everybody has to discern for themselves whether they want to go or not. But if you think you can't go until the church approves it, that actually is not correct. Don't let that be an excuse not to go, because that's not what the church teaches. The church looks at the fruits that manifest in the lives of people when they go there. And that's part of what they look at to determine whether this is authentic or not. So I just wanted to say that too, to dispel that argument that you're in disobedience to the church if you go there until it's, before it's approved.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're still unsure, the church, as you've said, has actually now permitted pilgrimages led by parishes to Medjugorje. So you really can go if you want to go.
You really can go. Yes.
Yeah, it's fine.
And not only can you go, I would argue that Medjugorje, if you do a little bit of studying, a little bit of research, this is one of my favorite things to talk about. I won't say that, I'll say this briefly, but the fruits that are coming out of Medjugorje are phenomenal. The graces that are being poured out in Medjugorje are phenomenal. And it is a place where God is intervening in the world today. It is a place where graces are being poured out in such abundance that, I, who've been taking groups there for 25 years, I have seen miracles happen on every single pilgrimage. If you want a deeper infusion of grace, yes, we can get it at parishes. Of course, we can get it at every parish, every church, every mass, every sacrament of reconciliation around the world. But for whatever reason, there are particular graces being poured out in Medjugorje right now that where people go there and they experience those treasures of the church in a more powerful way than so many times they experience in their home parishes. So I would like to challenge people, go there and experience it. Go there and find what it is that, God is doing there, because God is doing something incredible there. And there's so much more to say about that, but I just wanted to say that little pitch for Medjugorje right now.
Well, thank you very much for that, Anne. And thank you just generally for all the information that you've given us here, or me and the viewers, during this interview. I hope it certainly makes people think about it a little bit more, particularly those people who, as I said, have a real issue with this. The bishop said no. Look into that a bit more. As you've said, Anne, you don't have to take Anne's word for it. You can look look on the internet, find it online. It's all there to read. And yeah, once again, thank you, Anne, and thank you for the chat. Thank you for your time, because you've done it a second time. So thank you for giving me your time twice.
Thank you, Wojciech. It took a little bit of persistence on both of our parts, but we got it done. So I just hope and pray that people that people will hear this message and help spread the news, because there's a lot of people who don't know the truth. And, we just want people to know what's actually going on there. So thank you for this opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you, too. God bless.
God bless.